I'm going to share some ideas that Ethan and I were talking via email. He said maybe something around speaking skills and then evaluating skills, because I know that's a big part of what you all do in your club. And I'm sure they'll come in handy, not just in Toastmasters, but also in your professional life, in your personal life, in a lot of different areas. So you'll notice there I also wrote how to become more competent and confident. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end, why I think those two words, competent and confident, are important, as well as speaking and evaluating. So can everyone see my screen okay? You can all see it? Yep,
Yeah.
great. Excellent. All righty. And you can still see me, hopefully, somewhere. All right. So, question for you all, and I'd love to hear if someone wants to call it out or if you want to type it in the chat if you'd like to. I have a question about why is public speaking so hard? Why do you think it's so difficult for people to do? Anyone have a thought? Why is it not just easy for every person? We don't just all naturally get up and start doing speeches. Yes, Michelle, why do you think it's so hard?
I think public speaking is super hard because the stress of being watched by possibly thousands of people
Yes.
just stresses the person out.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. Yeah, it's a very stressful sometimes because it's very weird in life to have just a bunch of people staring at you. Normally, like if you're talking to a group of friends, maybe there's one or two people listening or paying attention. But then if you add five more people and 10 more people and sometimes hundreds, it's almost like, whoa, what's going on? It becomes very stressful, and it creates a sense of fear because it's just a natural thing. And I often say public speaking, the fear of it is actually it's a physical fear. It feels like it's in your head, but it's actually a physical reaction to having a lot of attention on you because it's not a normal thing that we all have. And so usually if you have a lot of attention on you, you feel like, oh no, I have to say the right thing or I have to be perfect or whatever. And that's definitely not the case. Everyone is quite forgiving, but sometimes we can feel like it's difficult to do for that reason. Interestingly, if you think about little kids like who are 2 or 3 years old, they don't have that kind of inhibition. They're very open, very happy. They sing, they shout, they jump around, they dance, whatever. But when we get a little older, especially as we become teenagers and adults, we tend to start to pull ourselves in and worry what people think. And that's usually one of the reasons public speaking becomes so hard. So I think that there's three reasons or things that I have learned. So I'm going to share them with you, and I'm sure you'll relate to them. The first, I think, is a fear of failure. So very often when we get up to speak, we think, oh no, am I going to do a good job? Is someone going to, criticize me, or will I mess up? Will I forget what I was going to say? And we start to doubt ourselves. And so this fear of failure starts to get in our heads. It's almost like a little voice inside saying, don't mess it up. Be careful. What are you doing? What are you thinking? And so that fear of failure is there. Eventually what that leads to, if we fail or we fear of failure, we start to have a fear of judgment. So we think everyone else is thinking that I'm doing badly, or that I sound weird, or they notice that I missed a word or something like that. And so the fear of judgment starts to stack on top of the fear of failure. And then if it keeps going, eventually we have what we call fear of rejection, which is where we're worried people will either laugh at us or, criticize us or whatever, which actually rarely happens, but sometimes we think it's going to happen. And the worst you'll probably get is someone just, politely pretending to listen to you. But sometimes it feels like there's a huge fear of judgment. Does anyone relate to any of those three fears in your life? Yep, I can see everyone nodding. Yes, absolutely. Yes, so it's very common to have that fear of failure, that fear of judgment, fear of rejection. And the good news is that as time goes on, if you keep working on your speaking skills, you actually start to lower them. They don't go away completely. When I get up in front of 100 or 200 or 1,000 people, there's still those fears there. But if you've practiced and developed your skill, they do lower a lot. So that kind of leads me to my second point, which is that I think of public speaking as a skill. And you might think, well, that's pretty obvious, Daniel. I mean, yeah, it's clearly a skill, but it's a very special type of skill. And really, if you think about anyone that you admire in the world, let's say I use the example of LeBron James because most people know who he is. You might look at him and think, wow, he's rich and he's famous and he's a celebrity and he's won all these championships. But actually, if you think about it, what you probably admire about him, if you are a fan, is his skills. his ability to play basketball at a very, very high level. And it's the same with anyone, whether it's a musician or a comedian or a public speaker or whomever, a business person. It's actually their skills and their knowledge that you admire most of the time. And so that's why I said public speaking is a skill as well. And very often, if we think of it that way, it makes it easier for us to start to improve it. Whereas if we think it's just this thing that we need to get, I need to be better at public speaking, we don't think of it as a skill. It can sometimes kind of restrict us. So the thing I started to think about many years ago was, okay, if it's a skill, and there's people who are very good at this skill, then I can learn it as well. So I started to ask myself, okay, what can I learn? And if you can see behind me, that's a real background. That's really my bookshelf there. There's a lot of books there on public speaking and communication that I learned a lot from over the years. And so, how do you improve a skill? Well, there's a couple of ways. So, the first is kind of exactly what I was just talking about. You can learn by theory. So, you can read books, you can listen to podcasts, you can watch training videos, you can listen to audio programs, and you can learn a lot of skills, whether about communicating or public speaking, just from watching trainings. And I recommend doing that so you can learn a lot of good ideas and ways to start a speech, to close it, to have interesting points, to be more entertaining, to draw the audience in, all those kind of things. That's the first way you can do it. At some point, though, just learning by theory, you'll notice, doesn't get you very far, especially with something like public speaking, because it's a practical skill. You have to actually do it. And that's where you start to learn by experience. So you need to actually put yourself in the arena. You have to step up, and we've all done that, right? You have to volunteer to do a speech or table topics, and you think, okay, here we go. And amazingly, when you do it, you probably learn something every time. Even if it is something where you think, oh, I'm never going to do that again, or that was a mistake, you learn from that experience. So I think really the most valuable thing that Toastmasters offers us is almost like a playground or a place to practice and get experience, and in a safe way, because we're all going through the same thing. So that's the second way. And then the third way, which is kind of what we're doing here tonight with me, but also you can do this with a lot of people, is learning from others. So if other people are more experienced, they have that skill that you would like, you can go to them and say, how do I do that? Or what can you teach me about how to do that? And very often, people who are experienced, they've already spent a long time studying the theory, so they can kind of shortcut your learning sometimes. Sometimes they can't because you've got to learn it yourself the hard way. But I've had a lot of public speaking mentors and coaches and past world champions who've coached me over the years. Sometimes I listen, sometimes I'm a bit bullheaded and they don't, but learning from others is definitely a great way to improve your skills. So those are the three things that I would suggest. And by far, I think learning from experience is the fastest way to get better. But if you add some theory and you learn from others, it will really enhance your skills. And that's what people will admire you for. All right. So now I've got a couple more things to go through here, so I'll keep speeding along. One of the things, Ethan, we had mentioned was how can we improve our speeches? And I have learned that there's three great elements or three elements of a great speech. And this actually comes from Aristotle. So some of you may know who he was. He was a famous philosopher back in ancient Greek times. So this is a very old theory, but it's very useful when you're thinking about speaking. He had three different components of a speech that he talked about. There was the ethos, the pathos, and the logos, and those are all Latin words. But ethos essentially means the credibility of what you're saying. The pathos is the emotion, and then the logos is the logic or the facts, the details. So to break that down a bit and make it a bit more modern, I kind of came up with these three things. And these are three things I always try to add into any speech that I do. So I try to have some personality of my own. I try to add some emotions in, whether it's humor or it's excitement or something like that. And then I try to have some logic as well, some kind of facts or details. So if you go through it, so personality is really about sharing your experience. Like I did in the beginning, I told you a little bit about what I've done and where I've come from. And hopefully, as part of that, you could feel my energy and enthusiasm. And sometimes I'll have humor in my speeches so that gets people laughing. So that will share feelings and opinions. And that's very valid. As a speaker, you're able to get up and share what you're feeling and thinking because it's your speech. So don't ever worry about, oh, I think this, I feel this. It's okay to be able to. Last one is the logic. And this is where if you really want to convince people, if you can add some logic or some proof to what you're doing, that will help people to believe you. Obviously, in school and things like that, there's a lot of logic, there's a lot of facts and details and things we have to learn. So you're probably very used to doing that one for academic reasons, but the emotions and the personality I find really round out any good speech that you do. So if you can think about, okay, what can I add to my speech where I'm showing a bit more of my personality and my experience? Or can I add some humor or some true stories or something that has a bit of emotion or my opinions? And then finally, can I back it up with facts or proof? You'll find that people tend to lean into your speeches a lot more. So that's the first thing. The next thing about how to improve your speech is to start to add extra elements in. So the first one that I've learned that works really well is to try to solve some sort of problem. So the way I think about this is to say, okay, if I'm going to speak to an audience, what problem will I solve? So today, obviously, I'm trying to help you to solve the problem of feeling fearful as a speaker or not having experience or knowledge. And if you want to improve as a speaker, hopefully my ideas will help you to solve that problem or begin to. So whatever speech you have, if you can think in terms of what problem will I solve for the audience or what problem are they dealing with, that helps them to actually be much more interested. Because if I was just speaking about something random that had nothing to do with your interests, there was no problem for you to solve here, you would start to tune out. So trust me, if you ever get to go to like jury duty or something like that, and you don't really care about solving the problem, you will start to tune out very quickly. So it's very good to have a problem if you can that you're going to solve for the audience or some sort of challenge or something like that. The next is the story, and this is where you can actually share your own personal stories, experiences, and explain what you learned from it. So it's all well and good to share a story, but if there's some sort of lesson or some sort of takeaway from it that you can share with the audience, whether it's something they think differently or they do something differently or they feel differently, then that will grab them as well. So stories are really useful to get people interested and entertained. And anytime you watch a movie or a TV show or whatever, it's really just stories. That's why we're interested in those kind of things, is because of the story element. And then the last one is, what can we give the audience that they can do or they can think or they can take away? So it might be something they can think differently or they can say differently or they can do differently. And so in every story, every speech that I do, I try to have a problem, I try to have a story, and then some sort of takeaway that you can learn or you can actually apply. And if you do that, along with the idea of having the personality, having the emotions, and having the logic, you will find that you really build very compelling speeches. And it doesn't matter if they're long or short, they will actually be really interesting. All right, before we move to the evaluation section, does anyone have any questions about the speaking? Oh, actually, Ethan, are we going to do speech questions at the end? Is that the way you'd like to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, you got it. All right, so I'll keep going now and I'll just talk about evaluation. This is one last little section. And then we can, if anyone has any questions, I can answer them about speaking skills. So, being an evaluator is another big part of Toastmasters. And as you become more experienced, I'm sure you all have had a chance to be an evaluator by now. And sometimes it can be daunting because it's almost like a mini speech in itself. You have to get up and say something and try and help the person who you're evaluating to improve. And sometimes you might think, well, I don't really have the experience or the knowledge. And whether that's true or not, you still do have your own personal experience and opinion. And that's very important as a person because you are listening to them, you're experiencing what they're saying. And so being an evaluator is really about your take on their speech and what you gain, what you gain from it, and then what you think they can improve. And there's really three things that I try to boil it down to. Toastmasters has its own evaluation guidelines, obviously, that are very detailed online. But there's three things that I'm always thinking about, and they all start with the letter I. So first is interest. If I'm thinking about, I'm evaluating someone's speech, what got my attention? So what grabbed me about the speech? Was it a story? Was it some fact that they shared? Was it their emotion or their humor? Was there something that made me have attention? And then the next is, what did I learn? So was there something different or a new insight, something that I could take from it? So that's the second one. And then the third is just, what do you remember, which is the impact. So how did you feel after the speech? What do you remember from it? And what do you think if you talked about the speech the next day or, a week later, what do you think you would still remember? So when you're evaluating someone, if you just stick to those three things, what got your attention, what did you learn, and what do you remember about the speech, that's a really good way to give people some good feedback. And then if something's missing from those three, you can say, maybe the opening could have more of an attention getter. something where you grab people's attention, or maybe you could share more of your own personal insight, or you could give them a takeaway. So there's all these different things that you can do, but I find if you catch one of those, it will give someone something very valuable as an evaluator. So it takes a little while to get confident as a speaker and evaluator, but I think all of you are on the right track just being here. So that is how you do that. And the very last thing that I want to share today is I began when I first started talking about the idea of being competent and being confident. And this is really a big insight that took me a long time to understand about speaking. Very often when we think, oh, I just need to be more confident, I need to have more self-confidence, that will help me be a better speaker. What we actually miss is the competence. And so there's a difference in the two words. Competent means your personal skills or your abilities, whereas I believe confidence or being confident means that you trust yourself. You have self-trust. So if you think about in your life right now, there's probably things that you're actually very competent at. Maybe it's playing a certain video game or reading or studying or something like that. Or if any of you are learning to drive, maybe it's you're getting a little more competent at that kind of thing. You have all these skills and abilities already in your life. And wherever you have that competence, you actually have confidence. You trust yourself to be able to do it. If you're not competent at something, if you're new at it, that's when your confidence sort of erodes or you start to doubt yourself. So what I've learned is, especially with speaking, if you can focus on the skill and the abilities and keep doing it over time, your competence builds. It will start to build your confidence over the long term. And really, that's what I've done over many years. I'm still doing it to this day. I'm still studying and reading and learning more and practicing like I am here. And that has what really has helped me to grow. And at the end of the day, my final takeaway for you is that public speaking is really a life skill. So what I've learned is that not only does it help you in professional life, in your career, but it's amazing. You can use it when you're speaking at a wedding or, it's a public event, or if you're socializing, you can tell a story and you feel much more confident as a person. And so not only does it help you in one way, but it actually echoes out into a lot of different areas of your life. And so I would really encourage you all as you're going through and developing, think I'm improving my whole life, not just my public speaking skills, because public speaking really is a life skill. So thank you. I'll pass back to our Toastmaster.
Hey, thank you for that very informational and helpful workshop.
Of course.
So, let's give it a round of applause. And I guess now we can start the Q&A session. So does anybody have any Q&A questions for him?
Or if you have any specific challenges with your own speaking that I can maybe help you with, if you think of something you struggle with, maybe I can give you some ideas that I've learned.
Anyone who has a question can just unmic and ask. I think I can start us off with somewhat of a more general question when it comes to evaluations. So for public speaking, as you mentioned, the three pillars are, of course, in audience engagement. First of all, are you solving a problem for the audience?
Yes.
Are you telling a story to them? And sometimes I think something really common is that we might get too wrapped up in the topic of what we're speaking that we forget to kind of relate it to the audience. What are some of your suggestions on that aspect?
Yeah, that's a great point, William. One of the risks I think as a speaker is that you get so caught up in the content of what you're talking about and what you're speaking about that you start to forget the audience is there a little bit, especially as you become more confident. You start to get very impressed with your own ideas. And as an evaluator, that same thing happens, to your point, that we look at the speech and we just think of the speech itself versus the delivery or the engagement with the audience. And so really the idea of if you can solve a problem for the audience, something that relates to them, or you can speak to them, you can share a story that they would relate to, then they're more likely to be engaged with you. So if there's some sort of commonality or something that you've done that's similar to them, like in the beginning when I started talking, I was talking about how I was sweating and my voice was breaking and things like that. And we've all been there. We've been through that, and that was the truth. That's what happened to me for almost 3 months when I first started my Toastmasters journey. So if you can find ways to relate to the audience, either by talking about a problem you've had that they have or some sort of story or experience, I think that's the best way to engage them. and pull them in. So if you're evaluating someone and those things are missing from their speech, that's a great way to encourage them to think about, okay, what would be a problem they've had that the audience also has? And if you can share it, the audience will kind of lean in and go, oh yeah, me too. They want to hear more. Great question. Thank you.
I think I can have a question. So,
Yes.
do you have any strategies or advice to give for how to recover from a memory lapse, or if you forget what you wanted to talk about?
Absolutely, yes. So when I was speaking in the World Championship in 2019, I was in front of around 2,000 people, and I completely forgot what I was saying because I was doing a speech. It was actually about a friend of mine who passed away, and so it was a very emotional speech for me. And even though I'd practiced it many, many times in the moment, I just lost my way. And so what I've learned is to just breathe and take a moment. The audience is always with you. And even in a huge audience like that, everyone wanted me to succeed. And then just try to figure out what was the last thing you said or where you're up to. And sometimes you'll end up repeating something or you'll say something similar to what you've already said, and that's okay. But then you'll probably find that you'll get back on track. If you have a very clear outline of your speech, and so there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and maybe you have particular stories or a clear point, that makes it easier too, because even if you miss one part of the speech or you completely forget one part, the whole speech has kind of a unifying theme. So it makes it easier. But I would say, first of all, go easy on yourself because I promise you the audience wants you to succeed. They're not going to start, yelling at you or booing you or anything. And especially at Toastmasters, and most of the time, if you can just relax, you'll find that you find your place a little quicker. The worst thing you can do is kind of go in your head and think, oh no, I've lost my place. Now everyone's judging me. And oh, what was I? That's when it becomes worse. So if you can just give yourself a little bit of reprieve, know that it's normal. And I promise you, I've done it on the biggest stages in the world and nobody cares. Everyone was still very kind and supportive and wants you to succeed. So if I can recover from that, I promise you, anytime you forget what you're saying, you can recover.
Cool. Thank you
Great
for
question.
that.
Any other questions or challenges people have, or anything you'd like to improve about your speaking? Maybe I can give you some ideas or insights.
I actually had a second question,
Of
and
course,
it's
please.
more of speech structuring and speech composition of the
Yes.
sort. So I know there's a lot of different ways to write out a speech or prepare for one. Some people like to write it out in its entirety word for word and then memorize
Yes.
that. Some people like to just have an outline. I'm one of those people who likes to just have a rough outline and then kind
Mm,
of leave the rest to impromptu as I go
mhm.
along.
Yep.
I'm not sure whether you'd recommend that over having it say written out word for word.
A great question. Yeah. So there's both of them are useful in certain situations. So if you think about wherever you are, there's usually kind of what do you want to say, like a formality to the situation. So if it's a more formal situation, like let's say it's like a graduation or it's some sort of formal event like a wedding or it's a business announcement or something like that, sometimes reading that is very important because you need to have very specific wording and details and things you want to share. And a lot of people will forgive that because they know you are doing it for the purpose of relaying information. So in that instance, it's totally okay to read your speech and to have it written out completely. And also, if you're a brand new speaker and it makes you more confident to have it written out, I think that's okay too. But I like, William, your method of actually just having an outline of the key points. So you can see when I was sharing there, I just had the key points of what I was saying and I talk around them. Because I've been doing this so long, I'm able to do that more now. And it sounds like you're able to as well. For people who feel more comfortable with that, you can just share one point and then you can talk a little bit about that point, and then you can tell them the next point and the next point. And I would say if you can start to try to do that, especially in a safe environment like Toastmasters, it will make you a more confident and competent speaker because you can really then just have three key points, a beginning and a close, and you get used to delivering that. The other thing is too, if you think about, say, a musician, say, I don't know, like Taylor Swift or whoever, she has a certain number of songs that she performs at a concert, right? So she doesn't do brand new songs every night. She has the same songs that she does. So as speakers, we're kind of similar in that we do very similar stories or very similar themes. And so if you see me speak at 5 different events, I'll probably share a similar story, sometimes the same story or the same joke, or I'll have the same opening part or something like that. So as you get more experience as a speaker, it's almost like you collect all these different speech topics, kind of like a musician has their songs. And some of them are big hits, people love them, some of them aren't as popular, but you can kind of use them as you want to. And so that also helps you to become a better speaker because you know your material. And yeah, so both to it's a long answer to a good question is I would say in some instances reading is very important because it's very formal. And then in others, if you're feeling confident and competent to actually just work on the outline, try that and see how it goes. And you'll probably do very well. Hey, what do you do to overcome stage fright? Oh, that's a big question. I wish I had a magic formula for you to say it's very easy to get over. The reality is the best way to get over it is to keep doing it. So to keep putting yourself in the fear zone a little bit, do it a piece at a time. So the beautiful thing about Toastmasters is that you don't need to do a complete speech immediately. The nice thing is you can do a table topic, or you can be the R counter, or you can be the person who reads the mission statement or something like that. So you do a little bit. It's almost like if you think about running a race or a marathon or something. I don't know if anyone's ever done that. If you're out of shape and you try to run 5 miles, you'll collapse because you're not in shape. But if you just start off walking and maybe you run for 1 block and then the next day you run for 2 blocks or something, very quickly your fitness will pick up. It's the same thing with your confidence. And like I said before, if you have higher competence, so you work on your skills, over time you start to trust your ability more and the stage fright will go away because your body and your mind actually says, you know what? I'm okay. I've got this. I can figure this out. These people are okay and I'll be safe. I'll be okay. Because it's really just a safety thing. That's what stage fright comes from because your body thinks this is not a good idea. Everyone's looking at me. What am I supposed to say? And so it makes you want to run away or, it starts to panic. But over time, as you train it and you do it more and more in little pieces, you'll find you accidentally get better. And what I noticed as a speaker is one day, probably maybe about a year and a half in, I remember just getting up to do a speech and not worrying about it at all and thinking, huh, I wasn't actually stressed today. Oh, that's funny. It's almost like you forget that you used to have stage fright. And so I always try to have empathy because I remember what it was like. But most of the time now it's gone because I do it so much. So my advice, Kate, would be do it as much as you can, volunteer and push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone, and then your comfort zone stretches, kind of like getting fit. And then over time it will start to grow, I promise. But trust me, you're not alone in that. That's very common. And what's the best way to practice the speech? That's a great question too. And then Angelina, I'll come to you as well. So I would say to practice a speech, there's a couple of ways. You can definitely write it out and read it. Sometimes I like to actually read it and record it on my phone and then listen back to what I'm saying. I actually like to, it sounds kind of crazy, but I like to stand in my living room and stand up and deliver the speech because it's a physical activity. And so I'm up there doing the behavior. And I find it's almost like a muscle memory thing. If I sit down and just read the speech, it's different because if I'm actually speaking, I'd be in front of a group standing up. So I stand up and I imagine there's a group of people there, and that helps me to practice. And the other thing you can do too is practice just one little section of the speech. So maybe just the opening, just for the first minute or two, and just practice that section of 2 or 3 times in a row. And then you might practice the ending 2 or 3 times in a row. And that will help you to start to build a little bit more confidence in those parts. And then in the middle, you can kind of, figure out what parts you want to learn. So I would say just practice one piece at a time. Try recording it, listening back to it, reading it. If you're feeling really brave, record yourself on video and watch it back. And then you'll be like, oh, I've got some work to do. But it's probably the best way that I've learned is rewatching my own speeches and going, okay, I need to improve that, change that. And that's how you'll get better. And there was one more question. Was that Angelina? I think you had a question or you raised your hand as well.
Yeah, so I personally struggle with using hand gestures. So I
Yes.
was wondering if you had any suggestions or advice on when to use certain gestures or how to make them look more natural.
Absolutely. Do you find you use them too much? Like your hands are all over the place or you don't use them enough? What's your struggle?
I usually don't use that much.
Oh, you don't use too many. Okay, good. Well, that's actually a better problem to have. Some people have too many and they're constantly doing this and, or touching their hair or whatever. Not that I have any, but, things like that. So, yeah, actually having no gestures is probably a good place to start. When I first learned to speak, I had to train myself not to use my hands and just sit still. So if you're starting from that point, just think about if there's something that could add impact to what you're saying. So for instance, if I say to you, here's an idea for you, right? And I just hold my hand up like that, it makes you feel like the idea is a little bit more solid. Or if I say, I was really terrified, I put my hands out almost like a bit of caution. And I know it's in a virtual situation, but I try to match the gesture to whatever it is I'm talking about. Or I was thinking about something, or, like that. And your face can actually be a gesture too. Like if you think about things, or you're angry or worried or whatever. So your facial expressions can add to it as well. But what I would say is just try to add in maybe one or two little gestures into your speeches so that you can start to feel the impact of it. The other thing is people sometimes gesture too quickly. So in that example where I was saying about the idea, if I just say to you, here's an idea you can think about versus me saying, here's an idea you can think about, you can see the difference. If I just hold it, it makes you feel like that idea is kind of stronger. Whereas, so I would say whatever the gesture is, try and hold it a little longer, a little slower, a bit more grand as well. If you want hands out or up or thumbs up or whatever it is, and you will find that over time they start to add some impact to the speech. So, but the most important thing is they have to feel natural. So don't force them. Just maybe do one or two that you think, if I was to do, like say you were saying, way over there in the distance, like, and you move your hand like that kind of thing, that will give people a little bit more feeling of distance. So try to think of things like that. Or I was looking up at the top of a building or something like that, and that will help you.